Economic analysts have expressed dismay at the relentless upward trajectory in South Africa's joblessness. The latest stats say data revealing a 1 percentage point hike in the country's official unemployment rate, which has risen to 32.9%. That's as the formal sector lost around 245,000 jobs, while 17,000 others were shed in the informal sector. We are going to be speaking to Business Leadership South Africa CEO Busi Mavuso. Thank you so much for your time, Busi. Both the formal and informal sectors shedding jobs. Why is it that South Africa's state and private sector is continuously failing when it comes to creating jobs in this country?
We would not fail when the environment is what it is. You know, the truth of the matter is that South Africa still continues to be stuck in the low growth trap. And that is hugely concerning for us as businesses. And I think if you want to look at a proof point and a data point, you see the tax revenues, or rather the profits that we actually declare at SARS. You know, I remember the number the last time was quite low, when the reason why South Africa collected less tax revenues was precisely because the corporate taxes and the corporate revenues were actually low, you know, which tells you that the average South African consumer is under tremendous, you know, stress, as it were. Yes, we might have done a lot of work in as far as the structural reform agenda is concerned. We know that the energy security is being dealt with, and we are better at load shedding, you know, and at ensuring that electricity remains on. But transport and logistics is actually still not fixed. You know, there has been an improvement, but I think there was a report that came out, I think from the IMF, was it 2 months ago, which says that we are still losing about R1 billion a day, you know, from an economic perspective, with the transport and logistics not functioning at the level that it actually needs to function at. Last week, Friday, however, we had a meeting with the president, you know, the business government partnership, where we are focusing on the 3 areas of energy, transport, logistics, and crime and corruption. And the issue of transport and logistics actually received a lot of attention. You know, as a result, we have actually come up with a set of actions which we call sprint targets that we are going to be monitoring for the next 3 months. We have agreed that we should convene every 6 weeks with the president instead of every quarter, so that we can ensure that we monitor closely the progress, and we can ensure that, you know, we try and accelerate delivery and expedite delivery on some of these priority interventions that we think are going to be vital to economic growth and job creation. But as things stand, you know, things remain tough for South Africa. I don't think the withdrawal of the US aid, you know, would have made things any better. If you speak to people in that sector, they will tell you that that has had an impact of about 15,000 jobs. So I really think that it still remains tough for South Africa, and the geopolitical tensions are not going to make things any better, Dumisang.
Absolutely, and it's encouraging to hear about the sprint targets and really what justifies a need for that immediacy in addressing some of these challenges. Is it going to be a long-term view that is taken by both the private business as well as the state to ensure that these measures are put in place for an ongoing period, as opposed to just an impromptu way of using as a silver bullet, but in a sense having a framework in South Africa that is not going to have the same results as doing exactly what we've been doing for decades now?
You know, the 3-month sprint targets really came against the backdrop of the fact that when we met with the president in the beginning of the year, which was the 16th of January 2025, we had very clear targets that we actually wanted to achieve. We had very clear timelines, you know, by which we wanted to achieve those targets. Remember, we came up with a 3% GDP growth that we thought we were going to achieve, and that was obviously made on the assumptions of certain, you know, outputs that we were supposed to have delivered by now. For instance, on the energy front, we have said that the current energy availability factor is sitting at 62%. By the end of 2026, we'd like for it to sit at about 68%. And by the end of 2030, we'd like to push it to 75%. Now, when we look at where we are sitting at the moment and how we are tracking against those targets that we've set for ourselves, we can see that we are lagging behind, especially on transport and logistics. You know, I think at the moment we are currently, Transnet is performing performing at about 160 million tons. The target by the end of the year should be 193 million tons. But we are worried as the business community that some of the things that should have been attained by now, some of the things that should have been done by now have still not been done. And this was obviously a huge conversation that we actually brought to the meeting last week with the president. And that is what precipitated, these sprint targets. And it was very encouraging to have the president, commit to the 6 weeks meetings, because I think you can also see, that the one way in which we get ourselves out of this economic rout is by addressing our vulnerabilities, especially when the international situation is what it is. The only surest way of getting ourselves out of this mess is to fix our vulnerabilities. Otherwise, we are going to continue to be negatively impacted by these externalities. So this is something that we're going to be monitoring long-term. Structural reforms are supposed to be a long-term growth, but I think we are very clear about putting clear targets and delivery outputs, for specific periods of time. So this 3 months is obviously going to be very specific targets. After we have achieved those, we are obviously then going to be putting more targets that we actually need to attain as a country to make sure that we can get ourselves out of this situation.
Now, we are approaching a budget 3.0, unprecedented times, and I'm interested in finding out whether there's room within South Africa's fiscal framework for a deliberate attempt to ensure that there's at least regulation policy and maybe a lever that would say this is how South Africa within its fiscal framework is looking to cater for creating jobs.
Dumisang, your guess is as good as mine when it actually comes to that. I don't see, how the minister is really going to plug the revenue gap, that we actually tax revenue gap that we actually have as a country at the moment. I think the one surest way is to really try and find a way of how we can trim the fat within government. I don't know where we trim the fat, but we all know that there are a lot of inefficiencies, as that we have in government. So probably maybe this forces government, to start looking at things differently. It forces them to probably maybe start having different conversations, within government. We normally are very are obsessed about this institutional inflation as South Africa. There are institutions that probably should not be there in government at the moment. When you look at what they are meant to deliver, you will find that there is a similar entity within government that is doing exactly the same thing. So probably maybe this is a time where we actually, look at what those efficiencies, would look like. What are some of the things, that we're spending money on that we should not be spending money on, and really find creative ways of how we actually increase our tax revenues by reducing expenditure. But in terms of where the money is going to come from, when the unemployment, is increasing by 1% or has increased by 1%, you can clearly see that trying to increase VAT or trying to increase any of the taxes is actually a useless exercise, because who are you taxing? Because the stats are telling us that people are unemployed. So we're really going to have to look at reducing expenditure as a form, of trying to make sure that we deliver a budget that is actually going to make sense and that can actually address the needs of the South African economy and public.
Thank you, as always, for your input. Busi Mavuso is the CEO at Business Leadership South Africa, giving us more reaction around the latest jobs numbers that we received from Stats SA earlier today.